Welcome to the Speaking of Writers podcast. I'm Steve Richards. For centuries, Countess Elizabeth Bathory has been remembered as one of history's most infamous figures, labeled by many as the world's most prolific female serial killer. But what if the story we thought we knew was shaped more by myth, fear, politics, and misinformation than by fact? In her riveting new book, The Blood Countess, Murder, Betrayal, and the Making of a Monster, acclaimed author Shelley Puhak reexamines the legend of Elizabeth Bathory using newly uncovered archival evidence and fresh translations of historical documents. The result is a fascinating and haunting investigation into power, gender manipulation, and the making of a monster. Shelley Puhak is the nationally best-selling author of The Dark Queens and several acclaimed poetry collections, too. Her work has appeared in The Atlantic, Smithsonian, Time, and many other publications. Happy to have Shelley Puhak join me here on the Speaking of Writers podcast. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Steve.
What first drew you to the story of Elizabeth Bathory, and when did you realize, Shelley, there was much more to this legend than most people know?
I've always had an interest in marginalized histories, especially the stories of women. And I also have family roots in Slovakia, in the area that's associated with this legend. So it's a pretty horrific legend about a murderous, blood-bathing aristocrat. And once you hear it, it's pretty difficult to forget. It stuck with me. And when I've learned much more recently that there were more and more European scholars and historians who were questioning the entire legend, I kind of took note. And I was really intrigued, I think, by, at least initially, by, the potential modern day parallels. Because if Elizabeth Bathory was not guilty, then this legend, has to be among the most successful and longest lasting, I think, smear campaigns in history. And I think that's really interesting to look at in terms of our own, era of internet disinformation and misinformation.
The mythology surrounding Bathory has existed for centuries. What made you feel this was the right moment to revisit that story?
Um, I think for me, we have two potential horror stories with this legend. One is that there really is a blood countess. There's a mother who is torturing and killing other people's children. And if you believe all of the accusations, then there's also this whole group of women running a, satanic child trafficking ring, which, I think some of us may hear like overtones there, like, the 1980s satanic panic or other sort of moral panics, right? And then there's this other horror story, though, that could be that if this story is completely manufactured, then how do you get all of these educated, good Christian people to go along with it? So I was, really curious about how and why that could have happened. And if there were parallels to other cases like the Salem witch trials, other moral panics, and what we could apply from, what happened to Elizabeth Bathory in our own day and age.
Let's talk about Guinness World Records. They recently walked back its claim, naming Bathory the most prolific female serial killer in history. What was your reaction when you heard that?
Well, I was kind of about time, but I think the damage has already been done in some ways because most of us I assumed when I went into this that you don't end up in the Guinness Book of World Records as one of the most prolific killers of all time if you haven't done a single thing, do you? So I think I was, guilty of the same thing I think a lot of people are, which is you assume that, well, certain elements of this legend have to be exaggerated, probably. Maybe she didn't kill 650 girls, but that there's some truth to the matter. And I think what's frustrating for me is that it's just sort of been like left, right? Like, well, we don't really know. And I think we can truly know. We can get to the bottom of this. But unlike a lot of other cases, there's no formal apology or explanation. It's sort of just been dropped.
This is the first English language biography of Bathory in decades. What new archival discoveries or translations most surprised you during your research for this book?
So I think I was surprised that there were still things to discover. And I was surprised to find that there were things in Elizabeth's own voice, speaking particularly like exchanges with her servants. So I also had this idea of a countess who's essentially like removed from the people who work for her, right? Like this sort of invisible army that's making sure, the lace is just right on her gowns or, the food is prepared just so. And I was really surprised at how intertwined the lives of a lot of these aristocrats were with the people who worked for them and kind of how deeply they seemed to care for and be involved in one another's lives.
Were there moments during your research when your own opinion about Elizabeth Bathory completely changed?
Yes. So, um, like I said, I kind of assumed that where there's smoke, there's there's fire, right? And that if she were not a killer, she was at least capable of these kind of great cruelties. And this is part of the reason for her legend. And I was really surprised to find a woman who perhaps was not entirely likable, but certainly was willing to go to the mat for the vulnerable and for the people beneath her time and time again. And that was something that really surprised me. I think we have this view of this very cold and imperious, haughty countess, and that really couldn't be further from the truth.
Shelley, how much of Bathory's legend was fueled by fear of female power and independence?
Oh,
Hmm.
so much. I mean, if she's framed, right, there's quite a few possible suspects in all of this. And I think number one, we have, good old ambition slash misogyny, where we have the man who's acting as the prosecutor, a lot of other nobles, some of her underlings who all have good reasons to want her gone. And they even have nicknames for her. One of them is, our Jezebel, which tells you a little bit about how they see her. So that certainly came into play. And then there's also these other dimensions of international politics at the time, where she's essentially a chess piece in a series of high stakes international negotiations. And then we also have this new strain of religious fundamentalism and extremism. And she manages to also fall afoul of the same religious authorities, that are investigating and instigating witch hunts in the area.
Yeah, the accusations against her are shocking and gruesome. What evidence did you find credible, and what evidence seemed just exaggerated or manufactured?
What I think it was really interesting in this case is you have to almost have a timeline and see how the stories grew and also try to trace them back to when you have multiple people saying, who said what and following that back. So a lot of these, in fact, almost all of the initial accusations can be traced back definitively to one man who is a witch hunting pastor in one of Elizabeth Bathory's northernmost estates, who is really frustrated that he hasn't been promoted. He's on the lookout for witches and other sort of kind of satanic agents. And he really doesn't like her. He has personal reasons not to like her as well. And so for a lot of the initial testimony, everybody's saying, well, I heard it from this pastor, and then that pastor's hearing it from this pastor, and you trace it all the way back to this one particular man. I think the other misconception about a lot of the testimony against Elizabeth Bathory is frequently people hear a number. You hear over 300 witnesses, and that seems really damning. And there's two things that I find that shed a lot of light on this. The first is that those sorts of numbers aren't unusual for the time period. There are common witch trials with just, an ordinary woman in a village that can easily turn out hundreds of witnesses that are happening at the same time. So this pattern of trying to get as many people as possible to give some sort of testimony is very common. But the other thing a lot of people aren't aware is if you go through the actual depositions, the vast majority of people are saying they don't know anything. They're not offering any testimony at all. They're just listed in the record. But you'll have groups of people saying, I don't know what you're talking about, or people who will admit to only having heard a rumor. But they're not offering any testimony or any evidence. They're just agreeing that, yes, there is a rumor going around.
You paint a vivid portrait of a Europe filled with political instability, superstition, social upheaval too. How important was that larger historical context to understanding Bathory's story?
I think it's incredibly important because, first of all, we have all of this context in terms of how female rulers are perceived. We're at the end of the so-called Age of Queens, this period of a lot of female rule in Europe. And that really plays into a lot of perceptions about, formal, powerful women. But I also think like the way that we often talk about her ends up diminishing her true political significance. Um, Sometimes this is cast as like a local squabble that spins out of control, or sometimes that it's only about her land. And I think a lot of times what gets lost in this legend is the fact of exactly how important Elizabeth and her family were. They were this incredibly powerful dynasty that were direct rivals with the Habsburgs. There was this long tradition in her family of Habsburg resistance. And the investigation and arrest of Elizabeth occur at the exact same time as kind of border clashes between Habsburg lands and Bathory controlled lands. We have all of these attempted assassinations and arrests of other members of the family. And while she's under house arrest, there are ongoing negotiations between the Habsburgs and her nephew concerning, invasion, rescue mission. So she's really entangled in these international affairs, and sometimes that gets completely omitted from retellings of her story.
The subtitle of the book, The Blood Countess: Murder, Betrayal, and the Making of a Monster. In your view, how much of the monster was created by society itself?
I would say almost all of it, if not entirely. And it's fascinating how people can be made to believe the most monstrous things about, their neighbors, their friends, their employers. How kind of once that panic is unleashed, it sort of, can run rampant. And the speed at which, it can do so.
Your background as a poet really comes through in the atmosphere and imagery in this book. How does poetry influence your nonfiction writing style, if at all?
Well, first of all, thank you for that lovely compliment. Um, I think if anything, poetry teaches you precision. So really trying to capture the precise word, or the precise mood, but to do so as succinctly as possible. And I do think that the practice has led me to, it's influenced a lot of my, I guess, research techniques, because one thing that's really important to me is trying to go to all of the exact places. And I think that that can sometimes reveal some really interesting things, but also gives you a kind of a sense of the smells, just the elevation, all of these like sort of textures of daily life that hopefully can improve the narrative. One thing that really surprised me was I knew, for example, that Elizabeth was at odds with this pastor, but when you go and you actually stand on the grounds of her former manor, and you see how close the church is, you realize that they were staring, essentially at one another, that they're kind of close neighbors able to peer into one another's windows or, overtop one another's walls. And it really, for me, brought forth the kind of intimacy and the sort of claustrophobic air that this has, particularly at the end. And that was something I was really trying to bring into the narrative, with word choice and other things, particularly towards the end.
How did you become a writer?
Um, my third grade teacher, Mrs. Barnes, if you're out there, thank you.
Mm.
So, um, she had a deal with some of us, which was when we had finished our work, that if we worked on, a book, that we could kind of have this free time. And so in third grade, I set to work on a novel, and I think that was the first time, an adult I guess, gave us attention and acclaim for our own writing. And I thought, hey, maybe this can be something that you do as a grown up.
If you could sit down with Elizabeth Bathory for 1 hour, what's the first question you would ask her?
That's a very tough question because I have many. Um, I think I would really want to know why she did not flee. I have ideas as to why she didn't. But when she knew the noose was, kind of tightening around her neck and she had that option, I'd love to know what her thoughts were on why she waited and how much time she actually thought she had.
Were you a fan of Gothic history or true crime before writing this book?
I dabbled in like the occasional, podcast or mystery, but not entirely, no.
Did researching this story ever genuinely creep you out?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And there's a point where just reading through the testimony of any sort of true crime, I think testimony or witchcraft trials is just so demoralizing and disheartening and horrifying, and it would be difficult some nights to sleep,
Hmm.
afterwards.
What's something readers may be surprised to learn about 17th century Hungary?
Well, I think if I could say potentially maybe two things. I think one was how advanced Hungary had been. I think a lot of people are surprised to know that it was one of the leading lights of the Renaissance. Facts that there were printing presses, for example, all over Hungary, well before we have them in England or the Netherlands or any of the other places we kind
Hmm.
of traditionally associate with progress in that era. And I think the other would be the speed at which Hungary, once there was an invasion by the Ottoman Turks, how quickly it kind of toppled from its position of former glory, and how much of a psychic wound that was for most Hungarians, and how that essentially plays into Elizabeth Bathory's story, but so many other stories of this era that kind of quest for past glory and that confusion about how could we have fallen so far? Like how could we have been one of the leading lights of the Renaissance and now we're really struggling.
And Shelley, what is next for you in your writing?
I'm very superstitious, so I'm not gonna jinx it. But I do have a project that I'm just beginning to research.
And what do you hope readers ultimately take away from the Blood Countess?
Well, I hope that we've all learned, maybe through these like little glimpses of how the sausage is made, that uh, maybe we can't take everything in the history books at face value. And I also hope that we realize that a lot of the tactics that were used against Elizabeth Bathory, whether that's, gaslighting, projection, whisper campaigns, physical violence, just outrageous accusations, are still being used today, and to sort of be aware of those tactics and be on guard against them.
Shelley Puhak, the book is The Blood Countess, Murder, Betrayal, and the Making of a Monster. It's a gripping re-examination of one of history's most infamous women and a powerful exploration of how myths, fear, and misinformation can shape a legacy for centuries. You can find Shelley Puhak online and wherever books are sold. Shelley, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Steve.
And don't forget to subscribe to the Speaking of Writers podcast on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, and wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Steve Richards. Thank you for watching and for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.